Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Atlantic Council event, What Xi Jinping's Third Term Means for the World. I'm Dave Shulman, Senior Director of the Council's Global China Hub. Today's event is, of course, very timely, with the Chinese Communist Party kicking off its 20th Party Congress on Sunday. China watchers around the world will be analyzing substance of Xi Jinping's work report, watching for constitutional amendments, and of course, waiting to learn about personnel changes. Of course, the most important decision from the Congress will be the widely expected announcement of Xi's third term as General Secretary of the Communist Party. And virtually every other appointment will be viewed through the lens of whether it points to a further consolidation of Xi's authority within the party or a nascent pushback against his rule. As Atlantic Council Senior Fellow Michael Schuman writes in the report that inspires today's event, Xi has been working toward this outcome of renewed one-man dominance of China's political system for years. So while the world usually asks on the cusp of a party congress at this stage in China's political cycle, who will rule China, this year the important question is instead, what will Xi do with his power? And what does it mean for the world? Major policy changes are not typically enumerated at party congresses, but analysts will be watching for what Xi's further consolidation of authority portends for Beijing's approach in a range of critical areas going forward. Financial markets will be hoping for some evidence of pushback on Xi, given the arbitrary policymaking over the past 3 years that has created significant market volatility and a sluggish Chinese economy hit by strict zero-COVID containment measures and a crisis in the property sector. Xi's work report will be closely watched for any signs of relaxation of those zero-COVID measures, which, as Michael writes, have suppressed economic growth, badly damaged small businesses, and fomented widespread public frustration. And this was clearly demonstrated just 2 days ago when a brave man managed to hang banners criticizing Xi and zero COVID on a bridge in a tightly controlled Beijing ahead of the Congress. Observers will also look for renewed calls by Xi to overcome unbalanced development, as he has put it, and what this means for the often promised and never delivered upon pledge to boost domestic consumption and reduce the economy's reliance on excessive investment. In the foreign policy domain, many expect Xi to emphasize the increasingly challenging external security environment that necessitates the more aggressive approach to defending and advancing Chinese interests, which has characterized Xi's rule, particularly vis-a-vis the United States and its allies. Stepped up attention to the global south in the work report would underscore China's growing strategic focus on the developing world, and many will be attuned to how Xi promotes tech innovation, indigenization, and military-civil fusion as core priorities for the next 5 years and beyond. Last, but certainly not least, Xi's treatment of Taiwan and any shift on the principle of so-called peaceful reunification will garner special attention, given China's growing military, diplomatic, and economic pressure on Taiwan under Xi, growing tensions with the United States, and the very real risk of a spiraling crisis in the Taiwan Strait in the near future. So, despite the presumed foregone conclusions regarding Xi's ability to achieve his political aims at this Congress, the range of implications of Xi's successful power play gives us quite a lot to cover today. And we're very fortunate to have a panel of truly leading experts across all these domains, from the economic to foreign policy to military and beyond. Before we get started, just a reminder that our audience in Zoom can submit questions using the Q&A feature, and we will try to address them at the end of the discussion. And now I'd like to pass it over to our moderator for today's event, Ellen Nakashima. Ellen is a national security reporter for the Washington Post. She is focused on policy issues at the intersection of technology and national security, including U.S.-China issues. She has been part of 3 different reporting teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes, including a 2018 prize for work on Russia's efforts to influence the outcome of the 2016 presidential election. Ellen, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the Atlantic Council China Hub for pulling this timely discussion together today. I'm going to briefly introduce our esteemed panelists who really don't need introductions, but let me go through these anyway. As you know, Michael Schuman is a non-resident senior fellow in the Atlantic Council's China Hub and an author and journalist with more than 25 years of experience in Asia. His most recent book is Superpower Interrupted, The Chinese History of the World. And as Dave noted, he's written a paper which has bequeathed the name for today's event, What Xi Jinping's Third Term Means for the World. Michael joins us from Beijing. Susan Shirk is a research professor and chair of the 21st Century China Center and Director Emeritus of the University of California Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. Susan first visited China in 1971 and served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs in the Clinton administration. Her new book is titled Overreach: How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise, and she's joining us from Brooklyn today. John Culver, hi John, is a non-resident senior fellow with the Global China Hub and a former senior CIA intelligence officer with 35 years of experience analyzing East Asian affairs. He was National Intelligence Officer for East Asia from 2015 to 2018, where he oversaw intelligence support to policymakers on East Asian issues. And he wrote a paper for Carnegie this month titled How We Would Know When China is Preparing to Invade Taiwan. And he joins us from Washington, D.C. And Arthur Kroeber is the founder of Gavekal Dragonomics, a China-focused economic research firm, adjunct professor of economics at the New York University Stern School of Business, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The second edition of his book, China's Economy: What Everyone Needs to Know, was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. He joins us from New York City, so we have a truly global panel here today. And let me turn it over to you now, Michael, for a quick opening, highlighting the sort of main points of your new paper.
Thanks, Ellen. I mean, the main message of my paper was whatever Xi Jinping's been doing for the last 5 years, I think you can expect him to do even more of it in the next 5 years. That's assuming, of course, that the upcoming Congress is starting on Sunday. Will go as planned, and he will get his third term and probably emerge even stronger, with an even tighter control over the party than he already has. I think that there's still some kind of lingering hope in China circles that maybe once Xi Jinping secures his term, that he'll alter his policies or change in certain ways. I personally don't believe that. I think he's told us very clearly in the last 10 years what his ideas are and what his goals are, and I think he will continue to pursue them going forward in the next 5 years. In the area of economic policy, I think if you're hoping for a return to liberalization, I think you're going to have to keep hoping. I think you'll see continuation of a focus on state-led industrial policies, and I think kind of subverting the private sector to the national goals of the state. And I think you'll continue to see a focus on economic security over economic efficiency, which isn't great for growth and economic growth and income growth going forward. I think in terms of foreign policy as well, you're going to see a continuation of a very assertive stance towards the world and a pursuit of Chinese interests, especially in regard to the United States. And Xi is going to continue his efforts to remold the global order in ways that are friendlier to China and China's interests. That also includes Taiwan. I think you'll see a continuation of and maybe intensification of this more militant position that Xi has taken towards Taiwan. And actually the Congress hasn't even started yet, but we're already seeing indications of this kind of doubling down on policies that are closely associated with Xi Jinping. We've seen that with zero COVID this week. There's been widespread hope that once this Congress is over, that there may be a loosening up on zero COVID policies, but it's been made fairly clear in the People's Daily as well as in the pre-party communique that this what is all-out war on zero COVID is going to continue. The People's Daily said that a loosening of that policy would be the equivalent of lying flat, making a reference to a social movement here that the government doesn't like very much, where as people are reacting against kind of a high-powered Chinese rat race. The other countries that are taking, they basically have given up on controlling zero COVID are basically slacker countries, and China is not going. China will continue to show the determination that needed to win the war with COVID. That's the message this week, and I think that's an indication overall of where Xi's policies for China are going.
Well, that's a pretty stark assessment there, but I think one that is largely shared by many commentators. I want to just throw it open to the panelists and ask if any one of you has any different assessment than Michael on how she is likely to take the country, in his third term. Is he not going? Is he going to? Do you see any signs that he will moderate on or take a more pragmatic approach, if not on zero COVID, then anywhere in his economic reforms? Opening it to you all. Susan, maybe?
Well, this is a pretty remarkable moment because the party has really based its legitimacy on economic development for so many decades. And that's what has guaranteed that the Chinese public would support party rule. And here, Xi Jinping, on the eve of this political transition, the Chinese economy is on the ropes. And many of the reasons have been inflicted by Xi's own policies. So it's a pretty difficult situation. So if we're saying that he's not going to make any changes, then we're suggesting that he's so hubristic, so dogmatic, that even these very high costs will not influence his economic policy. That's a pretty extraordinary thing to say. I'd be really interested if Arthur agrees with that.
Yeah, I agree. I would say around 80% with what's been said so far. First of all, I think it is important to recognize, and Susan, I'm sure you'll agree with this, that actually the sources of the Communist Party legitimacy are a little bit broader than just GDP growth. A lot of it also has to do with maintaining a stable, safe environment and making people feel good about being part of a great power again. And on those latter two, I think she scores pretty highly. We don't obviously have good public opinion polling. But anecdotally, it seems like there are plenty of people in China who are, number one, okay with the idea of being kept safe from a pandemic that has exerted a lot of toll elsewhere, and also very much okay with China's higher standing in the world. So I think there's been a rebalancing, unquestionably, of the priorities there. And there's no question that Xi Jinping is much less concerned with maintaining a particular rate of GDP growth than any of his predecessors. And he's much more willing to trade off certain kinds of economic gains in order to achieve his broader governance and foreign policy gains. And I would totally agree with Michael on that. The one area where I would just maybe offer some caution is, I think it's absolutely correct to stress that she has centralized a lot of power. It's a much more personalized regime than we've seen in China for many, many years. That is really a difference. But we're also not talking about Putin's Russia. This is still a system that is very complex, that has a very large bureaucratic institutional inertia behind it. And if you look economically at the two major policies that are slowing the economy right now. One is the zero COVID policy, which has Xi Jinping's fingerprints all over it. And it's clear that he's ignored or run roughshod over a lot of countervailing views on that. But the other is the property crackdown, which arguably is having a bigger impact on the economy. And that's driven more by technocratic concerns that China had become overbuilt, that they had a debt problem that they needed to get under control. And it's not clear that that's driven just by Xi Jinping's political opposition to property speculation. That has the fingerprints of a lot of what you could call technocratic interests around it. So when I look forward to Xi's third term, what I'm interested in is clearly, I agree totally with Michael. He's going to have the same directions. He's not going to become more liberal. But there are these other forces in society and the government that tend to move in other directions. And I think we still have to pay attention to how those forces will interact rather than simply saying Xi thinks this, therefore we're headed in a straight line to something bad.
I'd like to get, John, your thoughts on that. To what extent will there be other technocratic forces within the government that might steer China in a slightly more, pragmatic or otherwise direction? To what degree is this more going to be an ideological one-man rule? And what are the implications?
I'll push back a little against the construct of either, consensus leadership or one-man rule, because I think you have to look at I don't want to let Xi Jinping off the context. If he's going to be chairman of everything, then ultimately he owns responsibility for how the system performs. But you have to look at the context that's unfolded over the 10 years so far of his rule, which has been characterized by a much more aggressive U.S. pushback against, from Beijing's perspective, China's rise writ large. So none of this is happening, in a vacuum. We're into the fifth, sixth year now of a trade war, which has not been curtailed. If anything, in some respects, been doubled down on by the Biden administration. And so you've seen this reflected even as far back as the 19th Party Congress in the shift in lexicon, including Xi's lexicon, away from development as an objective goal, tied to GDP growth, and to development security, which is more lashed into national security. And it was interesting when the Biden administration this week announced new restrictions on Chinese access to advanced semiconductor manufacturing technology. The US noted that because China's pursuing civil military fusion as kind of the interlinking mechanism between national defense and economic security, that shows why the US needs to undertake these policies. So I have a hard time sort of viewing Xi in isolation and the policies he has pursued or likely will pursue, and I agree with virtually everything that's been said so far, from the context of this, rivalry with the United States, which has become front and center in official documents of both sides. The new national security strategy by the Biden administration mentions China, I believe by some count I saw 54 times. And so he has to deal with the anticipation that what had been the most important stable relationship is now becoming the driving adversarial relationship with enormous capacity to threaten security in a more fundamental way than the communist parties had to worry about. And I'm not denying that a lot of that is because of China's own actions and some very logical reactions by the United States. But I think that's an important context for not only what she wants, but the environment in which she has to operate.
Michael, would you like to respond to that? I think your paper makes clear that it's a lot of this adversarial relationship. Your point of view, I think, is that it's of China's own making, or am I misreading?
Yeah, I mean, I think John made a really good point that the competition with the United States has, I feel, kind of started to overwhelm Chinese policy in many aspects, not just in terms of foreign policy and security policy, but almost across the board. And you can see this, for instance, in economic policy, where Xi's focus on self-sufficiency and import substitution is very obviously aimed at decreasing China's vulnerabilities to the outside world and specifically to the U.S. and the kind of action that the Biden administration has taken in recent days in regard to the new export controls on chips and chip-related equipment. This is exactly what Xi Jinping is trying to protect China from. Honestly, I even think, going back to, we were talking about zero COVID, I actually see it in zero COVID policy as well. The Chinese government has created a narrative that its success in controlling the COVID pandemic in China in a way that other countries, specifically the United States, have failed to do is a sign of the superiority of the Chinese government, the governance system. And this is a narrative I think the leadership feels is still very powerful and very useful for them in their greater ideological competition with the United States. in showing that, here in China, we're more responsible leaders, we're more capable, we're more competent, we care about our people more. This is what's coming out of the Chinese global propaganda machine. And of course, compared to the US, which is a declining power in chaos and, couldn't control COVID. The outgrowth of that is you have a continuation of zero COVID policy. So I think what you're going to see going forward in the next 5 years, and however long Xi is going to be in power, is more of this, more decisions that Xi makes in Beijing are going to be with an eye on the competition and growing, I would say, confrontation with Washington, and how China is trying to, one, protect itself, and two, advance its own interests against the United States.
And Arthur, at what cost does he continue these policies? At what cost to China's own economy? What signal does it send to investors? What are the implications there as well for U.S. policy, do you think?
Sorry, I was on mute. It's an interesting question. I'll make maybe 2 points on that. So first of all, Michael's absolutely right to point to, Michael and John both right to point to the emphasis on security as the theme, and sort of everything, even economic policy, is a lot more about security than it used to be. And I think totally agree with John's point that this is a reaction to what is perceived as a more hostile environment. But it's complicated. So if you look at the direct economic response to both the trade war and the Biden technology sanctions, on the one hand, there is an effort to increase import substitution and create, local variants of the products that they've been importing from the U.S. But they also recognize that that's really not a realistic goal in the short term. So the other thing that they've been doing is significantly reducing the barriers to foreign direct investment. So the most objective measure we have of that, those barriers have fallen by about half over the last 5 years. And they have been trying very hard to encourage Western and European technology companies to increase their investments in China. So on the one hand, they want self-sufficiency, but on the other hand, they also want to increase foreign participation in the economy, partly because they need the technology, and partly because they see that as political leverage. If you have Western companies that are dependent on the China market, then they are available to push back against tougher policies from Washington and Brussels. So I think that whole dynamic is a little bit more complicated than simply, oh, we're going to do everything ourselves. The second point is, if you look forward, there's been a spate of sort of estimates about what China's economy is going to look like over the next decade. Everyone is kind of revising down their overall estimates. I think the only thing I would say there is, I think we want to be a little bit careful about extrapolating too much from what we see right now, which is pretty bad, right? If you go back 1 year, China was actually outperforming the rest of the world, both in terms of COVID control and in terms of economic growth out of the epidemic. 2020 and 2021, they did much better economically than most other major countries in the world because they were very successful at controlling COVID. So we're now in a dip where there's kind of a perfect storm of bad factors. And I think there's a little bit of a tendency in the analysis now to say that this is going to be how it is for the next 10 years. And I think we should be cautious about extrapolating too much from the particular circumstances at the moment. Clearly, there are going to be some efficiency trade-offs, but this has always been the case in China. The government has never been a pure efficiency optimizer. They've always looked for a big role for state enterprises. They've always looked for ways for the state to control and guide the economy. This is more extreme with Xi, and I think there are some real issues with it. But I think the most likely outcome is that China will continue to grow at a few percentage points a year, a little bit faster than the U.S. For the next decade, and continue to increase their technological basis, even if they struggle with the cyclical management.
From a geopolitical standpoint, we've seen China aggressively defend its interests globally, including through the use of so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. If Xi comes out of this Party Congress with the wind at his back as most expect, do you anticipate even more of that behavior? Or do we think that greater self-confidence might enable him to begin to repair relations a bit with, say, Europe, if not the United States? Jump
Are
ball.
you aiming that at me?
I think
I wasn't
Yes,
sure.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you know, in this very centralized political system, all the subordinates, all the diplomats, what they're most concerned about is their own careers, and they feel that they need to satisfy Xi Jinping's wishes. They're kind of bandwagoning on that. And if Xi Jinping encourages that kind of wolf warrior rhetoric, then you'll see Wang Yi, if he continues to be the senior most foreign policy maker. I mean, we've seen the transformation of Wang Yi from one of the most effective Asia-oriented diplomats in the Chinese diplomatic corps to kind of the #1 wolf warrior. And I think you'll continue to see that because everyone wants to fall in line with what Xi Jinping wants them to do. And of course, that's very counterproductive in terms of actually improving trust and better relations, especially with Asian neighbors and with the United States. I mean, we see that there are all these coalitions that have formed to balance against China, largely due to China's own assertive and wolf warrior type behavior. But one thing I'm sure we will see is the Chinese policy will try to put wedges between us and our allies. And on this semiconductor embargoes, for example, which is a unilateral move of the United States, I'm sure there'll be very avid efforts to try to prevent European countries, the Dutch, the Germans, especially the Koreans, for sure, not to join forces with the United States. So, you know, you'll see a mixture of some of that more positive diplomacy, but aimed at putting a wedge between the United States and other countries.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Or
I'll jump in. Mostly just supporting Susan. I think that it's hard to be diplomatic when many of your policies are abhorrent to much of the free world, especially the United States and Europe, and then some of the democracies in Asia. If you're committing massive human rights violations in Xinjiang, if you're suppressing democracy in Hong Kong, it's pretty hard to find a diplomatic way to defend that. And I think it may not be so much about pleasing Xi Jinping, but it is popular with a lot of Chinese, this more aggressive stance, because they, like a lot of populations, like a lot of public opinion issues, people want their government to stand up and, at least rhetorically, fight. And so China's doing that. I mean, the MFA used to be criticized, not least by the PLA, for being insufficiently robust in their defense of China's interest and China's priorities. So I guess in one sense, you can say that problem is solved. I'm not sure it's good diplomacy. It doesn't really seem to win friends. And if you're running your foreign diplomacy, public affairs in a way designed to impress your nationalistic public, it's probably not going to work well as foreign policy. I don't know how you could get more dogmatic, but I am prepared to be surprised in the next 5 years of Xi's term. But I kind of agree with Susan that I think you should see, at least on a country-specific level, if not the Twitter or Weibo, WeChat level, an attempt to really moderate this, because otherwise they're just, helping the United States.
Michael, real quickly, from your perspective in Beijing, do you see that, or?
Well, looking ahead for the next 5 years, to Xi Jinping specifically, I feel that he benefits from a lot of this aggressive messaging that we've seen out of the Chinese government and the Chinese media. He's justifying his increasingly one man rule of China, as characterizing himself as the man who's going to stand up for China, the man who's going to bring about the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. And as you see other important aspects, sources of legitimacy of the Communist Party, mainly on the economic side, start to falter in the next 5 years, 10 years, then he needs this kind of nationalist messaging even more as a way to justify his own government. So I feel going forward that some of these nationalist causes, especially Taiwan, that you see so much rhetoric on now coming out of Beijing. I feel like he increasingly needs these causes for his own political purposes. And I think from a purely diplomatic standpoint, I think they need to start moderating this, because it is whatever benefits he's seeing at home, he's kind of losing the game abroad in the way that he's alienating so many other governments and the public opinion in many other countries. So I think he'll have to find some kind of way of balancing these two contradictory political needs. But at the same time, if things in China continue to go where they're going, he needs to appear the fiery nationalist going forward as much as he has in the past few years.
So I want to move to Taiwan quickly, but first, before I do, briefly, realistically, right? How can China and the United States and the West really pull out of this sort of non-virtuous cycle, and where both Washington and Beijing are sort of taking actions in response to one another, and in some respects perpetuating a downward spiral? How can they pull out realistically, and what would that new relationship actually look like? Real briefly, does anyone have?
Yeah, well, I think it's time for a new effort from the Biden administration to try a little traditional diplomacy. We haven't had any real negotiations other than on the accounting standards for about 6 years. And we've just been talking about how inside China, the view is that America is unalterably hostile because its rhetoric is hostile. We have presidents, Republican and Democratic, basically saying the same thing. We have this bipartisan consensus, but bipartisan consensus has the downside of people not really weighing the costs and benefits of our own policy. And it seems to me that we are kind of driving Xi Jinping's China to be more of a threat than it has to be by our hostile policy. So a little more diplomacy in which we identify a few areas where we think we could make progress. I mean, there are many issues on which we're not going to make progress. I mean, we're not going to negotiate anything to do with Hong Kong or Xinjiang, most likely. But on economic policy, trade policy, even things like, access for journalists, even South China Sea and maritime behavior, I don't think it's impossible to negotiate some more rules of the road and a kind of stabilization of the situation in the South China Sea. So I think the US side could be doing more diplomatically. I don't think our expectations should be huge. I don't think we're really going to change Chinese foreign policy fundamentally, but I think at the margin, we could encourage greater moderation on their side.
John or Michael? Do you think there's any chance we use diplomacy, or do we need different tools there?
I take a slightly different view on that. I agree completely with Susan that there needs to be more diplomacy, and I think that there are a number of areas where, in theory, you could see some progress. Watching it from the Beijing end, I'm not convinced that the current leadership is in the place where they actually really want to have constructive dialogue. They give me the impression that they're interested in mainly trying to compel other governments to align their interests with China.
So if you were sitting in the National Security Council, then what would you do? What would you advise the president to do here to really change the direction? Is there anything realistically they can do other than what they've been doing?
I think that the Biden administration continues to stress that they do want to have dialogue, and I think they need to continue to find ways to press to have more dialogue. My point is, I'm not completely sure that the Chinese are particularly receptive at this moment on their end. They have their own foreign policy agenda, and they have their own goals that is not simply a reaction to U.S. foreign policy. And Xi Jinping is going to continue to pursue those goals, even if the U.S., let's say, softens its stance on certain issues, or even if there is dialogue. I think that's I think it can change the direction of Chinese policy somewhat on the margins. I think it's a mistake, and I see this among certain analysts, to think that, oh well, if Washington changes its policy, you're going to see a dramatic change in Chinese policy. I'm not actually convinced about that. I'm interested in John's view on it, actually.
It's not that different. I would just sort of, this is going to sound like I'm really irrelevant, but we do diplomacy for our reasons, not to please China. And I think that was true of past administrations. And I'm not arguing for a return to the kind of more abundant, too formalistic S&ED kind of model, strategic economic dialogue and security dialogue, which had sort of become a ritual for its own sake. And on its best days amounted to sort of the first day of Festivus, where we were airing our grievances. But that's important. You know, it's important in this world, especially still somewhat in COVID lockdown in China, and then restricted diplomatic avenues internationally, to be heard directly, not filtered through media, either Chinese or Western media or social media, to have more avenues to be heard. And you may not be there to exchange flowers and cakes, but you want to have an ability to understand your interlocutor, to get a feel for the person on the other side, and especially after the party Congress. You know, it's kind of amazing how we've talked now for 40 minutes and haven't gotten into any of the normal horse race kind of aspects that we'd be talking about, because there isn't a horse race to discuss except, you know, which of the Politburo Standing Committee members will still be around and which new ones will be completely subordinate to Xi Jinping anyway. So I think we should take the opportunity, once the government's in charge, especially after the National People's Congress in the spring, to return to some of these avenues, because the hardest thing that we could face, that we want to avoid, is to try to rebuild crisis communication capacity in the midst of crisis. You know, if there was another incident today, like the EP3 so-called incident in 2001, where a deep personal dialogue between Bush and Jiang Zemin, and then especially between our ambassador in Beijing and our defense attaché and known counterparts in the People's Liberation Army and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, allowed us to resolve that crisis in 11 days. If we had something like that today with the US aircrew forced down into China, we wouldn't get them back in 11 days. It could be something more like the Pueblo in North Korea back in the 1960s or 70s. And so we want to have a capacity to be heard. And I think we ought to take the opportunity after the Party Congress and the National People's Congress to rebuild sort of necessary connectivity so we aren't forced to do it in the middle of a crisis.
And one of those crises might well be Taiwan. That is one of the big questions on people's minds is, will Xi Jinping in his third term push harder or faster on the so-called peaceful, reunification with Taiwan. John, you've written a paper about Taiwan recently. What are your thoughts? How much risk do you think there is for a significant crisis with Taiwan in, say, the next 5 years?
I think there's risk, but it has more to do with the shifts in the nature of the Taiwan dynamic, the Taiwan situation writ large, not just on the island, than with the designs of Xi Jinping. I still believe, I have a catechism that I've created for myself. Xi Jinping still sees Taiwan as a crisis he needs to avoid, not an opportunity that he wants to seize, because of what it would mean for long-term direct potential military conflict with not only Taiwan, but the United States and its allies, and then the economic repercussions of that kind of conflict. At the same time, though, if Taiwan or the United States in combination took steps that erased the underpinnings of normalization of relations, I think China would go to war tomorrow. And I think that it would be, I use that term, go to war, in kind of the old-fashioned sense, not just invade or fire missiles or whatever, but actually an all-of-regime effort to set the conditions for unification. And I think that unless Taiwan collapses quickly, which is possible, or the US refuses to intervene militarily, as we have in Ukraine, because China also is a soon-to-be major nuclear power, then I think it'll be a long war. And I think there are things like the things that actually Xi is emphasizing on development security and economic security, not just growth, could be very important. Probably insufficient for the scale of conflict we'd be talking about, but it would, in some ways, what he's been doing would be helpful to China if they face that kind of more high-end, open-ended great power struggle that could last years.
Well, Xi has said he doesn't want to pass the Taiwan issue down from one generation to the next. And so short of military action, what other actions might he take to enable him to declare success on Taiwan policy?
Yeah, I wonder if hindsight, if he's I'm sure he hasn't, but it seems like this was 100 years ago and not 7 years ago when Xi Jinping met with the president of Taiwan, or the head of the Kuomintang party, at that time Ma Ying-jeou, in Singapore, for the first time since the end of the fighting part of the Civil War. And at that time, you had millions of Chinese traveling to Taiwan every year. You had millions of Taiwan citizens living in China, involved in economic activity primarily. And, perhaps he should have just taken the opportunity to sort of declare unification, say that this satisfies the main requirements, that we've got significant cultural, economic, and people-to-people interchange across the Taiwan Strait, and we can build on that toward a more perfect union, if you will. Well, that's water under the bridge. I think that things are getting so adversarial that, not to be too gloomy, I think it's going to take a crisis. In a way, I feel like the US and China, and then, the immediate audience of Taiwan, is sort of in the early stages of the old Cold War. We're in like the 1950s, before the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the potential for escalation and even really horrific conflict is looming large. And I'm not prescribing a conflict as a way to shift to the more stable phase of the new Cold War, but I think that might be what it's going to take. It's going to take a crisis where both sides and then our respective allies and partners stare into that abyss for a moment and imagine what's at stake before we can get past this kind of messy arraying phase. China decided internally 10 years ago that they were headed toward a rivalry with the United States, mostly because of the apparent, to them at the time, rapid decline of the US. And, the US, in a way, politically at home, domestically, as the China and the Taiwan issue are discussed here, we're kind of still in the arraying phase. We haven't yet gone through like a wholesale reorientation of the Department of Defense, despite stated intentions in the last 2 national defense strategies to do that. We are occupied with the war in Ukraine. We've just concluded major wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan that lasted for 20 years. So I'm sort of waiting for the next phase, and I hope we can get there without the analog of a Cuban Missile Crisis, but I think it might be what it takes.
Michael, turning to Russia and China for a moment, we saw the declaration of the No Limits Partnership in Beijing in February. Last month, we heard Putin say he understood that China had questions and concerns about the war in Ukraine. Going forward, particularly as relations between Moscow and, Beijing and Washington get worse, do you expect to see any market change in China's strategic relationship with Russia, or indeed maybe even stepped up support for Moscow as Putin's regime is increasingly stressed? And what form do you think that support might take?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of press recently that, talking about how it seems that the Chinese are sending signals that they're kind of having some buyer's remorse or stepping back a little bit from the relationship with Russia. I personally don't see it that way. I think this is what you're seeing in the China-Russia relationship is almost kind of playbook Chinese foreign policy. That they will ultimately, what Chinese foreign policy is about China, and they will maintain their cooperation with Russia, and as long as it suits them and in ways that it suits them. And I think from the Beijing's perspective, whatever is going on with in Moscow and in Ukraine, I think from Beijing's perspective, they still see a lot of benefits from a closer relationship with Russia. I think it helps them with some of their goals about reducing their reliance on the West economically. I think they see Moscow as a potential partner in their efforts to kind of remake the global order and to push back American power. The Chinese will continue on the Ukraine issue to try to pretend that they're neutral, and they'll continue to make an attempt to play all sides, and they'll continue to try to make amends with the Europeans, for instance. But I don't see at this stage them making any kind of dramatic break with Russia.
But maybe I'll jump in here, if you don't mind. That it seems to me that one important objective of US policy should be to be clear about treating Russia and China differently and not driving them closer together. And the fact that China is not tangibly assisting Russia in its military actions in Ukraine is a position we'd like them to keep. And we don't want them to assist Russia any more than they're already doing. So, I've just been struck by the fact that the US side doesn't, when China does what we would like them to do, we seem to have a really hard time acknowledging it publicly and kind of giving them credit for it, which would help maybe keep them in that position.
Yeah, can I just make a quick addition to that, which is I totally agree with Susan's point on that. I think it is worth reminding ourselves that China's position on the Russia-Ukraine war, leaving aside UN votes, which are purely symbolic, but in terms of their concrete position, is basically not that much different than virtually all of the rest of the developing world. So the people that have joined in with sanctions on Russia, with actively promoting that, are essentially US security allies. It is not actually a global alliance. And so I think China's position on Russia and Ukraine looks quite a bit different if you're looking at it from Brazil or India or one of these other countries, which is also basically trying to keep a distance from it. And so China has essentially adopted what is a very widespread position, and they have been very, very scrupulous about not breaking any of the sanctions that we have imposed. And I agree that should be acknowledged.
Let me mention one other thing, and that is that the Xi-Putin relationship, their personal relationship, is something that each of them seems to really value. They have a affinity as fellow strongmen for one another. But by and large, the Chinese elite and even the Chinese public, there's no love lost between China and Russia. And my hunch is, and well, in fact, I've been told by people from China, even though I haven't been able to go there, there are still some opportunities for communication, and that many people in the elite do not support this alignment with Russia at all. And so, again, that's a reason for the United States to show some recognition of China's position, because those people surrounding Xi Jinping will see that Americans are not so blind or unalterably opposed to everything China does, and its specific actions matter, because there is this widespread ideological framing that Xi Jinping and the official press have inculcated in China, that the United States is just bent on bringing China down or containing China, tripping it up. So when it does the right thing, it's really important to acknowledge that.
So in the time we have left, I want to bring in a few questions from the audience. Here's one going to the issue of succession. What would Xi's pick of a successor tell us about the future of the Chinese Communist Party? And do you think he already has one in mind, even if he doesn't explicitly name or indicate one at the party Congress? Anyone of you?
Well, you mean if he names a
If
successor?
he names one, and
I
also,
think that would be tremendous. It would be a huge surprise to everyone. And it would probably help reduce the pressure about the lack of power sharing within the Chinese political elite. I'm sure that many of these people are very frustrated with Xi Jinping's concentration of power and the bad decisions that seem to have resulted from that. So I think if he named a successor, or a successor emerged a week from now at the end of the 20th Party Congress, I think that would be a very reassuring sign in domestic Chinese politics.
but I actually think probably none of you probably expects him to designate a successor or a successor to be designated. So how concerned should we be about that? What signal might that send to the market as well, Arthur? And are there any indications that he might stay there for life? Like, do you expect us to be having the same conversation 5 years from now?
Yeah, my working assumption is that he's there until further notice, that we won't get a successor. I agree with Susan. If he did it and sort of returned us to a sense that there was going to be more orderly progression of power, I think that would be viewed very positively. I think from an economic perspective, the concern would be that, the history of authoritarian leaders who stay in office for a long time and accrete more and more power is that the quality of decision making tends to degrade over time. And so if you're concerned about good quality economic decision making and decision making in other areas, you have to apply a higher discount rate, as it were, the longer she stays in office. But I think politically, it's just not very realistic. It would actually be, I think, quite destabilizing in a certain sense for him to name a successor, because then that just sets up everyone to be jockeying for the next thing. So I don't think politically it makes a lot of sense for him to do it. So I think we're going to be stuck with him for a long time. And then to me, the concern is less about succession, but as I said before, what is the interaction between Xi as a very, very powerful single authority source and all of the other stuff that is going on in the bureaucracy and society, which, there's plenty of people and plenty of institutions and plenty of agency there. How do those forces of this centralized, powerful leader at the top and these other social and bureaucratic forces, how do they interact? So I think that's really should be the focus of our analysis and question, rather than worrying about the emergence of a successor, which I think is very, very unlikely.
We have a question again from the audience that says, many elites in China arguably feel they benefited greatly from Deng's focus on pragmatism and maintaining a viable working relationship with the United States, and are not happy with the direction things are going. Do you agree with that? And if so, how do you see this important group's relationship to China's leadership in the coming years?
Well, if I may jump in there, I do believe that Deng Xiaoping's legacy is really has been lost. It's been pretty much ignored and destroyed by Xi Jinping. And because there is no active politician who's become the focal point of resistance to Xi Jinping, Deng Xiaoping's legacy is really the ghost. I have a chapter in my book called Deng's Ghost. Deng's Ghost is kind of the focal point for underground resistance to Xi Jinping's dictatorial style of rule, because Deng Xiaoping himself warned against overconcentration of authority and arbitrary decision-making, of course, reacting to the Mao experience. And now that's really exactly what we have in China. So it's very telling that there's so little attention paid to Deng Xiaoping right now.
John, I think you raised your hand.
I'm going to push back a little bit. I don't doubt, I agree with Susan, there's certainly nostalgia for the Deng era, and maybe the brightest period in both kind of internal stability and openness in China in the late 2000s up to about 2010. But the system actually started hardening even before Xi Jinping. And I think they're actually, I just remind, I don't need to remind this panel, but Xi Jinping did not knife fight his way to the top. He was selected because he was a princeling, because of who his father was, because of his, relative successes at the provincial and then national level, because there was real concern, especially after the Arab Spring in 2009 and the global financial crisis, that the Communist Party internally was facing existential threats. So Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign, which certainly accelerated his consolidation of power, it also attacked what they viewed as kind of a core rot in terms of corruption inside the party, and especially the People's Liberation Army, where it had basically been running its own affairs for a decade under these two powerful generals who had been selected by Jiang Zemin, who was no longer in power. And so I think there was actually a lot of support for Xi initially. And then it's kind of been overtaken by this sense of existential struggle with the United States. So that continues to then drive this newer kind of reservoir of legitimacy, nationalism. But it's in the context of a much more kind of, and admittedly, I think, self-created hostile environment.
Okay, well, I think we've got one more opportunity here with 1 minute we have left for Michael to give us the final thoughts, sort of wrapping up this session as we head into the 20th Party Congress on Sunday. Michael.
Well, if I can kind of, in a couple sentences, sum up what I think everybody has been saying, I think generally everybody is hoping that, especially on the side of U.S. and China, that we do see more dialogue, that we do see a change in the direction that we've seen in the last 5 to 6 years, to at least kind of put some guardrails on what's happening with what seems to be increasing confrontation. But I also get a sense from everybody that there's quite a bit of doubt that there's going to be a serious direction in change of direction in policy in China on more or less any front. But we'll see what happens after the Congress.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for this thoughtful conversation, and for our audience out there. for joining us today. And thank you again to the Atlantic Council China Hub.
Thank you.